Pleasure and privilege to be addressing you today. This is a terrific event focused on an immensely important set of issues. I've had a deep interest in cross-sector social interaction for nearly 30 years, I guess. My academic career began focused on cross-sector and organizational collaboration, and so I think of this very much as home turf for me. Before I begin, I'd like to very sincerely thank the symposium organizers, the Kemi Business School, and especially Anne-Marie Ryan and Juana Bronzai for the lovely invitation. I also want to say how nice it is to see so many friends here today, or at least imagine you there today. I didn't realize it was going to be such a reunion. So my talk today is on place and partnerships, echoing the theme of the conference. And for me, interorganizational partnerships are a really profound mechanism for achieving progress in addressing significant global challenges like climate change, inequality, systemic racism, and right now pandemic diseases. My own interest in partnerships began nearly 30 years ago when Nelson Phillips, Cynthia Hardy, and I began doing research on collaboration in a variety of domains, including refugee settlement, ecotourism, HIV/AIDS treatment. At the time, we were working from a core intuition that there was something about the relationship between partnerships, institutions, and important problems in the world that we wanted to explore. Of course, we were following the work of many others, and especially the path-breaking work of Professor Barbara Gray. Our early work emphasized the role of discourse in mediating the relationships between participants, partnerships, institutions, and social problems. In our study of HIV/AIDS treatment, for example, we explored the discursive strategies used by community groups to influence the behavior of pharmaceutical groups and the policy of the federal government in Canada. More recently, I've been studying urban poverty on the west coast of Canada, where I was living for many years. My focus there was primarily on responses to drug addiction and homelessness, and in both cases, partnerships were central to the innovations I was observing. In doing these studies, though, I found that I had to expand the scope of what I was looking at. I kept studying discourse in institutions. Those were really my tools that were most at hand, most comfortable. But in both cases, these concepts were really insufficient to understand the partnership dynamics that shape the responses to those serious social problems. And so we started to develop alternative, more integrated framework. And the limitations of discourse and institutions as lenses, that was one of the central motivations that led Nelson Phillips and I to start to develop what we refer to as a social symbolic work perspective. So the core idea behind this perspective is that there are a wide range of forms of work examined in organization studies: identity work, institutional work, emotion work, boundary work. But the study of these different forms of work has remained largely disconnected. There have been, and especially recently, attempts to connect across individual pairings, mostly of these kinds of work, identity work and institutional work, for instance, or emotion work and institutional work. But the study of these different forms has not been integrated in any really significant way. And so that was the aim, that was our aim in developing the social symbolic work perspective. So that's the perspective I wanted to take today to apply to places and partnerships. So first I want to talk to you a little bit just about the perspective itself, and then I'll talk about a study that I did, kind of reinterpreting it both through a lens on place and partnership and through a lens that focuses on social symbolic work. So to start with, we define social symbolic work as purposeful, reflexive efforts of individuals, collective actors, and network of actors to shape what we call social symbolic objects. The book is largely focused on this idea of work. It kind of comes in many ways from previous work I've done with other colleagues on institutional work. And so it started embedded in and kind of motivated, rooted in the idea of work, and the focus of the book really remains on that. But one thing we found interesting, and it's especially interesting in relationship to the focus of this conference, is the significance of what we refer to as social symbolic objects. So when we began working on the book, we had this relatively simple aim of cataloging, organizing different kinds of work in organizations. But we realized that if we were going to suggest that these forms of work constituted some kind of conceptual family, that there had to be some core to that conceptual resemblance. So we had to start to develop some more elaborated understanding of social symbolic work as a concept itself. Now, there are a number of pieces to it, but the important piece for today is that all forms of social symbolic work are organized in relationship to particular kinds of what we call social symbolic objects. So these are a wide range of objects in organizational life. They could be strategies, boundaries, technologies, emotions, etc. More formally, we define social symbolic objects as combinations of discursive, relational, and material elements that constitute meaningful patterns in social systems. Now, this is obviously quite a mouthful, so let me unpack it a little bit. So first, we'll start with the idea of a pattern. Now, this is simultaneously a simple and a complex idea. What we mean by a pattern is a socially constructed, interpretable entity that describes some perceived consistency across space and time. Now, in some ways, I suppose that's the more complicated version of a complex definition. But if you think about examples, it becomes maybe a little bit easier. And so if we go back to Mintzberg, for instance, and his conception of strategy, he defines strategy as a pattern in a stream of decisions. And the point about patterns is that they're not independent of the social system in which they exist. They're dependent on the actors involved to construct, create, maintain, and hold those things as patterns. Lots of social symbolic objects, and in fact, we'll argue all of them have important material dimensions. So these could include everyday physical objects, furniture and tools, natural objects like flowers and food, but they can also involve concepts that we think of as institutional. So endangered species, refugees, conferences. The idea of a conference could be a social symbolic object. Now, if we look across the research on different kinds of social symbolic work, what we see is there's a lot of writing, a lot of research that has explored the construction and identification of different objects. But what's much less developed is an understanding of the relationships that exist among objects, how they're connected to each other, how they shape each other, and so on. And for us, these relationships between social symbolic objects are especially interesting as a potential future area of research. And the way we think about it is that the relationship between objects is not inherent in the objects itself. It's a matter of social symbolic work that connects different kinds of objects. So different kinds of work translate objects across time and space, as we see in the translation literature. We can think of work enacting objects as instances of broader categories or concepts. We could think of categories or concepts themselves being based on or kind of theorized out of existing sets of objects. And then there's also even work that inverts the meaning of objects to create new, related, but different objects. So we think of these kinds of moves, these moves connecting different objects, as representing a significant opportunity, both in terms of interesting theoretical ideas, but especially in terms of addressing significant social problems. And it's these relationships between social symbolic objects that I want to explore today in terms of the relationship between places and partnerships. And so what I'm going to talk about now is a study that makes this much more concrete and that allows us to conceptualize places and partnerships as kinds of social symbolic objects. Oops. So the work I was doing in Vancouver for many years was on urban poverty, in particular looking at drug addiction. And an important focus of this research was on the places that drug users consume drugs. So this included or referred to as safe sites, which was in many ways the focus of what I was doing. And I'll get into what those look like. But to understand safe sites, I think it's important to understand what might be described as less safe sites. So I'll keep jumping ahead, sorry. A not uncommon place at the time and even now for drug users to inject drugs was in alleys. And so you can see the picture on the right, typical downtown Vancouver alley. And these are places in which heroin and cocaine intravenous drug users would go. Typically together in 2 or 3 people was easier to do it with, often using puddle water to mix drugs with, often shaking the drugs in solution rather than boiling them in order to make them injectable. And in order to understand why places are so important in this story, you need to understand a little bit about drug use and overdose. And the key here is that most heroin overdoses are not necessarily fatal. If an overdose is responded to rapidly, it can usually and easily be treated with a simple injection of a stimulant. So it's when people who overdose are left too long that they tend to die. And so this makes the kind of geography of drug injection a really important part of it. Now, one of the problems for people injecting in an alley is that if they overdosed, they were dependent on whoever they were with to call for help. But those people typically also had simply just injected drugs, and they didn't have cell phones, which meant they had to go to a local store or a business and ask to use the phone or ask employees to call an ambulance. It also meant they potentially had to wait around for an ambulance or police to direct them to the person in trouble. So as you can imagine, this left a lot of people simply dying alone in alleys. And I won't go into the statistics, but the statistics were horrendous. So my study focused initially on Insight, which was North America's, or at least described as North America's first supervised injection site. Opened in September 2003, it's still open. And there's a whole kind of history since that time that I could talk about at some other point. Now, the interesting thing about Insight in terms of places is that even though it was described as the first injection site, supervised injection site in North America, it really wasn't. There were at least 6 or 7 that opened before then. I'll just show you a picture of the inside of Insight before we look at the previous ones, so you have an idea what we're talking about, given this is a discussion of place. Here's the inside of the place. This is what an injection room looks like. And it looks very, in many ways, unextraordinary. Those cubicles are for people to inject. The mirrors are so that the nurse who is sitting behind them can keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't get into trouble, but also gives them a modicum of privacy so they can be facing away from the nurse rather than toward, as the partitions are also meant for privacy. Now, what I want to do is talk through very quickly the evolution of the places that preceded this injection room. And so before Insight opened in 2003, the history goes back about 8 years. And so the first site that opened, Vancouver's first site, was known as the Back Alley. It was opened by Livingston, who was a single mother in the area, Bud Osborne, who was a drug user, poet, activist. And it was really just a couple of storefront rooms they rented. It was completely illegal, but was known to the police, and it was used by between 80 and 200 drug users each night. That closed a few months later, and there wasn't another really organized injection site for a number of years. But during that period, drug users started to open up their rooms as individuals to each other to use as safe injection sites, or these supervised injection sites. And so as a drug user said at the time, I open my room for anyone to come in and get high. But the thing is, after 8 o'clock, there's no visitors allowed in my hotel. So from 8 till 8, there's no place for people to go except for the alley. So we move forward a few years, and we get to a second kind of wave of sites. And the first one was another illegal site. It was opened on Dunleavy Street in the summer of 2000. And it was opened by HRAS, H-R-A-S, which was the Harm Reduction Action Society. It was a kind of diverse set of individuals, health workers, patients, drug users, researchers. And again, it was opened in part spurred on by Livingston again, who stood up in a meeting and just challenged people to do something. There were two more sites opened in this period, and these were interesting ones because these were not illegal sites, but they were specific kinds of sites, both opened by First United Church. And First United was a kind of classic urban church, long tradition of reaching out to disadvantaged residents, a soup line, clothing exchange, a welfare advice service, and so on. And so then in December 2001 and April 2002, it opened two demonstration sites. The first one was only open for a day, and it was intended to let the public see what a site would look like. They invited the media, they invited school groups, got quite a lot of press. And even though it was very short-lived, it was very intendedly realistic. They spent quite a lot of time building it to look a lot like the models they had seen of injection sites already established in Frankfurt. And then the church opened a second site in April of the following year, and this was aimed more at drug users, primarily as an educational facility, teaching them strategies on how to take care of their veins, how to do a proper tourniquet, how to ensure equipment would be sterile, and so on. So you have this middle wave of slightly more kind of elaborated, if you like, sites. And then the final wave of sites began a couple of years later. And this is a kind of interesting story because Insight is the name of the government's official supervised injection site, but there was a previous Insight that was unveiled, but it was never opened. So in February 2003, the Portland Hotel Society, which was a downtown housing NGO, opened also with the Vancouver area network of drug users and another NGO called Life Is Not Enough. They built and opened a facility that was intended to become the official Insight. The media were invited. There were 2,000 tulips to echo the 2,000 deaths that occurred in the overdose deaths in the area. And the media described it as 6 stalls where people could inject drugs, sinks and mirrors at each one, an observation platform at the back of the room, a spacious waiting room, and what they described as the feel of a low-budget art gallery. This was a kind of transition. It never quite opened, and there was a period, it was a kind of a pause because of political reasons that kind of led to the final illegal site opening on Carroll Street in April 2003, really just a few months before the government opened theirs. And for the purposes of this talk, what was interesting about it was organized by a coalition of individuals and groups. It had Anne Livingston again, Van Du, the drug users, an anti-poverty coalition, a housing action committee, a downtown legal society. It was rented by a religious studies instructor at UBC. It was partly funded by the previous mayor's son. And it also had the systematic involvement of academic researchers who were gathering data on injection sites. And so it was a much more complex, both social and material kind of operation. And finally, all of these sites culminated in the opening of Insight, the slide that you saw previously. This was a new supervised injection site, 12 seats, purpose-built at the cost of over $1 million Canadian. It opened in September 2003. And it was operated by a partnership, including Vancouver Health, Portland Health Society. It had the support of the city, endorsement by politicians, the cooperation of the police, and again, ongoing research by UBC academics. And so that's a very, very quick run through the kind of history of precursor places and partnerships in the development of Insight. Now, what I want to do is step back a little bit from the details of the places and partnerships to kind of conceptualize them as social symbolic objects and look at what this relationship might look like. And what I want to argue is that when you step back, you start to see a recursive relationship. Oh, I just messed something up. There we go. Just like a live presentation. So I want to step back and say that when we look across these sites, these safe sites, what we see is a recursive relationship linking the partnerships associated with them and the places that were formed. And the relationship becomes one that evolves over time, and I think becomes a bit more clear when we can understand these places as social symbolic objects and as the product of social symbolic work. And I mentioned in the definition of social symbolic objects that we think of these objects and work as having three key dimensions: discursive, material, and relational. And if we look at the evolution of those dimensions across the story, we can start to see, I think, some interesting kinds of connections. So if we look at the early sites, we see experimental places. We describe them as tied to interpersonal relationships. So in terms of materiality, the early places, the back alley, the drug users' rooms, they were really simple transformations of existing spaces. The discursive and relational dimensions of these places and partnerships were also relatively simple. The message, if you think about it in terms of meaning, associated with the places was simply, come be with us and we'll look after you. The transformations were tied to relatively simple, direct interpersonal partnerships, and Livingston and Bud Osborne, who became friends, and among individual drug users. If we move further through the story, we see an increasing complexity associated with the places and partnerships. The next three sites, the Dunleavy site, the two First United Church sites, they were more elaborate transformations, greater injections of material resources, more elaborate sets of meanings. So the meanings, for instance, of the places were not only in terms of care, but also in terms of justice and public health. The last three places, the First Inn site that never opened, the Carroll Street illegal site, and the Official Inn site, were what I describe as embedded places. The meanings of each of these sites included layers of science, government, progressive politics, as well as the ideas of care, harm reduction, and public health that were associated with the earlier safe sites. And not only were their meanings and materiality developed in more complex ways, but they were also significantly more connected to routines and relationships across organizations and systems. The interorganizational networks that formed them were publicly and explicitly debated in terms of the meaning of the relationships of the organizations and individuals involved. So my argument is that these relationships aren't coincidental. They're important links between the kinds of places around which action occurs and the partnerships to which those places are tied. Relatively simple interpersonal partnerships are supported and support experimental places. More complex, elaborated places are supported by and also support the interest groups that form them. And then interorganizational networks support and are supported by what I describe here as embedded places. So just to conclude a few thoughts, I want to make three quick points about an understanding of places and partnerships as recursively constructed social symbolic objects. And the first is a very simple point and familiar to a lot of people here. That when you're exploring places, it's really important to conceptualize them as more than locations or material structures. A key part of this is the meaning that's associated with places and consequently their situatedness in social systems and their connections to actors in action. The second and third points I think are maybe a bit more coming directly from the idea of social symbolic work, and that's that when we conceptualize places and partnerships as social symbolic objects, it allows us to explore them in terms of this set of dimensions, discursive, material, relational, that underpin them both. And rather than, as we often do, conceptualize each object in our study in kind of idiosyncratic ways, really separating identities from institutions or boundaries or technologies, focusing on underlying common dimensions, I think allows us to see the connections more clearly. I think that really flows into the last point, that these dimensions also allow us to more clearly see and kind of pull out the forms of work, both that are associated with the movement of objects and the connection of objects, but also the ways in which those objects act as resources for different forms of work. So let me just close with a word of thanks to the conference organizers. It looks like it's going to be a fantastic conference full of really interesting work on place and partnerships. For me, this invitation allowed me to revisit a study with a different focus that was genuinely kind of fascinating for me and kind of revelatory for my own understanding of the work I'd already done. I hope you've enjoyed my talk. I look forward to your questions and our conversation.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, I'm here on the screen. I'm not sure I'm not sure what I'm looking at anymore. But thank you so much for that. It's so insightful and so thoughtful, to making me very much think about partnerships and place. And it's wonderful to see the thematic realized in your talk in that way. Oana, are you on the call? You're there, yes, there you go. So Oana Bransley is now going to be our host for the Q&A for now and the panel thereafter. Thank you, Oana.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you, Tom. A lovely keynote. And we have 3 panelists for a follow-on keynote. So we will save the bulk of the questions so that you can integrate these topics in the context of the current applications of place. However, Tom has graciously agreed to take a couple of questions, just a couple of questions that may be pressing or maybe insights that have sparked during his talk and you are eager to share with the group. I have opened the chat room to everyone to a couple of questions. Let's see if we have any clarifications or any additions to what we have just heard. I know you're there. I know you're there. This is also a good call to Zoom norms to appear as a person and with video, please, so we can see each other, so we know you're there. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Jill. It's nice to see everybody, the whole community being populated and showing up to support this conversation. It is extraordinarily rare that we have an opportunity to see emergent theory in real time to crises that we have never had imagined living through. So I trust this will be an exciting evening for everyone. However, despite this excitement, I am getting no questions. The chat room is quiet.
I've sent a question, Oana. I'm not sure why you're not seeing it.
I have just seen your questions.
Okay. I just wondered in case there's a
okay.
Oh, here.
All right, wonderful. So I'm going to go to Myra first. 3 dimensions of objects, Tom: social, material, and relational. Can you elaborate on the relational aspect?
Sure, thank you very much. And thanks again for the invitation. Nice to see all the faces appearing. It would have been nice to see you all previously, but that's all right. It was just weird to see myself in 2 screens at the same time. The question about the dimensions is an interesting one. When we look at different kinds of objects, it's really easy to, if we think about place, for instance, move quite immediately to both a discursive or symbolic kind of dimension, and the material dimension is quite easy to imagine in terms of a place. But the relational dimension, I think, is really critical in the sense that if we think about any object, whether it's a partnership or a place, socially constructed, it's socially constructed in the context of some kind of social system with some set of actors, relationships, both kind of structuring the place, but also kind of providing the anchor for the meaning and linking the materiality to the meaning. And so that might be easy to see in terms of a partnership, because you might enumerate who's in the partnership, what the relationships are, and so on. If you think about a place, I think it's just as important. So if you think about the different supervised injection sites I looked at, for instance, some were small, populated by a relatively restricted range of actors. And so the first one's drug users, their allies, a few other people, and the later one's a much more heterogeneous, complex set of actors in terms of professional nurses, psychiatric workers, researchers, the drug users, and so on. And so I think trying to attend to that kind of relational dimension of objects is really important. I'm not sure if that directly answered your question.
I think you're onto the dynamics of the relational aspect, and I'm guessing there could be many different kinds of relational aspects that come out, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonnie, you're muted.
Sorry, all day at this. We are, I believe, ready for the panelists. We're gradually lifting off. We are going smooth, staying with community, but beginning to reconceptualize this embedded relationship through Tina Dacin work. I want to say that myself and the special issue co-editors have aspirations of a community that is deeply place-related and includes the meaning of place. However, these are new topics, and there are only a handful of scholars that were truly ahead of us, and Tom is one, but Tina is another. And the work that you are about to listen to has been presented. You may have been lucky to hear it at the Academy, but it really is a work in progress in terms of encouraging all of us to reimagine what community is from a place-based perspective. I don't think Tina needs an introduction, but I believe a collective word of thanks is in order, both for sharing this work with us at this stage, but also for engaging the community in this emergent type of thinking. So the panelists, all the panelists, as we will proceed, are sharing with the community new ideas, ideas that are being shaped in real time and by the conversation. And I truly hope that the conversation can be live and parallel to the talks, so we have a good collection of questions as we end the evening. So with that, Tina, if you would not mind taking it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Juana, and thank you to the conference organizers, and really immense thanks to Tom, who always inspires me. My head is fleeting in about 10 different directions right now, and I'm having trouble focusing because there's just so much that I want to say and that I want to speak about. I've always been a big fan of Tom's work on institutional work. In fact, it's guided several of my own papers thinking about institutional work. In fact, just recently, we had a paper that was accepted on vigilantism, looking at how people police spaces and places in the absence of institutions. And we draw on your ideas on policing very much in that paper. And as I think about this, I've spent the last 3 years embedded in Newfoundland. I've probably gone about 18 times to study small fishing communities, and living with fishers and eating with them and going out on the boats and learning everything about the sort of materiality of what fishing is about, looking at hand lining of cod, but also how boats are built and why they're so important and things like that. And then last year, I started a project that I spoke about at the Academy and in the Hebrides. And Helen, I'm in awe of Helen too, Helen Hawk, because she's such an expert in this context. And I actually haven't been. I was supposed to spend the month of June there this year, and had everything became canceled. But I've been following and studying Harris tweed, which is the only textile in the world that's protected by an act of parliament, and looking at community enterprises there and how they are protecting and making Harris tweed over time. So it's a historical study, mostly archival. Well, it probably will be mostly archival now going forward, but really looking at the process of how this evolved over time. So place is very central to the work that I've been doing over the last few years. So thank you, Juana, for talking about that. One of the things I wanted to just raise, and if I have 5 minutes, do you think, or yeah, is to reflect on how communities are navigating place post-COVID. And as we're thinking about this, how are places then being reshaped and changed, and how are we looking at what communities are doing? So I've been in touch in a lot of calls with the people in Newfoundland, and when you think of before or pre-COVID, Newfoundlanders are known for being welcoming folk, asking people to come visit. Tourism is where most of the money is made, and they're regarded as sharing their place with others. So when people come to their community, they share the place, and they're known as being amazingly collaborative. So people will help each other. They're at each other's homes. They're helping each other build houses and other things, and a very tight-knit yet outward focused. And when we're looking at things now in a post-COVID world, I see a lot of fear and I see a lot of anxiety because the tourism sector has been completely suppressed. And what I see now is a closed-knit society, very, very insular, and they're keeping others out. And they're very deliberate about this. So it's interesting because I follow almost every Facebook group there is about Fogo Island, and I'm on there because that's how they communicate. They communicate over Facebook, and it's the way that they do it. So it fits in lovely with the work on vigilantism, because what they do is they tell on each other if anyone's breaking the rules. And so you're thinking about how they keep track of who went where and who's coming over on the ferry. So they're very, very cautious about who comes to the island, where are the license plates, who's allowed to be there, who's not, who's an outsider. And it's a place that's really, I think, spinning a little bit. And it's very interesting to see, I think for me, in 8 months' time, how are they doing and how are they coping with navigating their place and safeguarding their place. So when Tom, you were talking about these amazing sort of thinking about these social symbolic objects, I'm thinking about how do these all shift now? And how do they take on new meanings? So before we had a sense of one set of identity of who they are, and now we have, they were a tight-knit community, but how are they rebuilding identities and boundaries as we're going forward? So those are just some of the questions that I'm thinking about in my head now, and that you've motivated me to do. I got to go back and reread your stuff. So I think it's great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Juana, I'm happy to jump in again later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tina. And I will try to give a fitting introduction to Raghu as well. While all the panelists are personal heroes of mine, I have to confess that Raghu was my very first academic hero when I was doing my dissertation on innovation. And what's extraordinary is that 2 decades later, he continues to move mountains and point the way forward to research questions that are worth asking. And in that spirit, he has agreed to utter out loud some of the questions that are guiding a new research project with Jake, that I believe Jake is also with us in the audience. So with that, I will just hand it right over to Raghu, and curious to know more about the current work.
Well, thank you very much, Juana and Anne-Marie. It's a privilege to address this audience and to go after Tom and Tina. Both of them are just fabulous scholars, as you all know. I was really inspired this morning by Tom's talk, and I'm going to give a counter in a sense. Tom is, if I may reduce his brilliant talk to a sentence, where is a safe zone? I'm asking, where is truth? If the big elephant in the room with SDGs and MDGs and all that is, science is going to set us free. And so the question is, where is science? And where is the truth? And the Greeks had a specific place, and that was Delphi. And they would go to talk to the goddess Pythia and ask the oracle what is going to happen next. And so we tend to look at the scientists, including ourselves. We consider ourselves as scientists as well. And people look to us and say, okay, what is going to happen next? So along with Jake Klopp, we have been looking at what we call as emergency science. And emergency science is not normal science, which takes its own time and effort. It is not post-normal science, which is based on simulation, and it's about the future, which has not yet happened, and on which many of the climate scientists are based upon. But this is right in the middle. It's in the present. It's not about the future. It's not about the past. It's right in the middle. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and touch. There'll be a lot of touch points with Tom's talk. Unfortunately, in 8 minutes or 6 minutes now, there's not much can be done, but still. So first, I really appreciate the notion of social symbolic work and social symbolic objects. So just to set the stage, I come from Karen Barad's work. And Karen Barad's work is primarily on relationality. And it comes on what is called as material discursivity. And so in that, it flattens the three objects that, or three dimensions that Tom mentioned in terms of social, material, and relational. So my own background is from active network theory, so you can well imagine where I'm coming from, and STS, broadly speaking, like Karen Knorr-Cetina and Gallison and all these wonderful people who have spoken about science. So the first point coming from Karen Barad is that you take an agential cut, and the apparatuses that you use, which is the objects that you're talking about, the apparatuses come into play. So that what you observe is based on the apparatuses that you are using, on the materiality which is there. So in that sense, the scientific enterprise is decentered. Number two, it is not just decentered, it is distributed. So for when people say there's a problem, they go and ask the experts. But the question is, who's the expert? And you talk to everybody. And now there's really interesting work about the sheep farmers becoming the experts. And that is the publics are themselves, the experts. And so there's a movement towards what is called as citizen science. So it is not only decentered, but it is also distributed on top of everything. Then on top of that, you understand apparatus might be different and people have different beliefs, etc. Scientists will not agree with each other. So it's a very, very conflicted kind of partnership which is there between science. And that's the good news, not the bad news, because it has got to do with skepticism. We really need to have the skepticism, otherwise we don't have science. Now, the problem is this, with emergency science, there's a third or fourth dimension, which is temporality, which I found that people tend not to talk about. And we definitely want to bring in temporality into the mix out here. With emergency science, what happens is that the time required for the science to unfold is compressed. And it is so compressed that it compromises the science which is happening by itself. So it is the experiment which is going on in Tom's point of view. He's got experimentation, elaboration, and embeddedness. The experimentation is going on based on a speculative bet. And in this case, we actually followed the molecule hydroxychloroquine. And it's kind of tenuous journey from the president's mouth into speculative bets and articles which got published and got retracted, and FDA, which is actually allowing for emergency application for the compound and then revokes it, and on and on. And as you look at the data, what happens is the data explodes. Even in 1 month, we can't put a hand around it. And the reason for that is that this one speculative bet, which is the conflicted discursive space, keeps on expanding and expanding. It kind of, instead of kind of elaboration, it is expansion which is going on, the explosion. And it brings into play politics, society, and other things into the mix. And what happens is then the last phase, which is in Tom's situation called embeddedness. In this particular instance, it implodes rather than explodes. It implodes in the following way. The Lancet, which published a paper on hydroxychloroquine, retracts that article. And FDA revokes the emergency use. I'm just giving you 2 examples. If you go into it, you'll see the violence which is going on. And so much so that Dr. Fauci, who is the expert on infectious disease from the government, he says, science has lost its way. And that the American publics are not believing in science anymore. So in a sense, emergency science is coming in. It is happening in the wild, distributed and decentered across time and space. And even as the space is exploding, the time is compressing. It's like a kind of an inverse pressure cooker, and as a consequence of that, what is happening is that science is losing its credibility. So I want to conclude with the following. When the truth is most required, it is not to be found. And it gets contaminated. And one of the reasons is because we are presenting the outcomes and the process of emergency science as if it is normal science. We don't even have a framework for understanding how emergency science should be constructed, how citizens should be involved, and how should that be spread around. As a consequence, the outcomes and process of emergency science are being evaluated as if they were normal science or post-normal science. And therefore, it has got seeds of its own destruction inside it. I think it's a very dangerous place that we are in. So where is safety? I think maybe Tom's presentation showed us where safety is, and I would go there for a shot or an injection if I needed one. But where is truth? I'm not entirely sure where to go. Well, thank you very much. And my colleague, Jake Klopp, also somewhere around, so he can answer the questions as and when required.
This is wonderful because you all know each other way better and longer than I have. And Professor Kallinkos is my newest acquaintance. We have only spoken briefly and recently. However, I have to confess I have read his most recent book cover to cover. And I felt like I have mastery over the new concept of materiality until we talk on the phone. And he gently and patiently introduced me to this universe of the digital and how the very notion of platforms are not like our reality becomes not just socially, digitally intermediated, but truly digitally reimagined. And it has been a treat for me. And as you know, the bios of everyone are extraordinary, and they're posted for your personal shame as we all continue on the quest to glory. But I would like to invite you to this last segment of the conversation in the panel as yet another boundary of our reality that we're willing to let it collapse and reconfigure so that we can go forward and be fit for service in a reality where our notions of community and science and technology are all collapsing and reconfiguring all at the same time. And with that, if I can invite Jannis to address the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. It's a privilege also for me to be here and be able to talk to you. I imagine that I'm a peripheral figure into your own discourses. So some of you over the years may have seen and used some of my work on technology and institutional change. It's been going for nearly 3 decades now. It's not been exactly mainstream, but it's quite known anyway. I'm going to talk then, also been impressed by the talk of Tom and Tina and Raghu. I'm going to talk about something different, what I thought Oana asked me to do, and is how the pandemic has transported us into another space permeated by digital technologies, and has to some degree called upon to replace or complement a great deal of activities that have over the years been relied on what we will call the common stuff of living, that is face-to-face relationships, physical participation, and local and cultural embedment. Granted that some of these effects will remain and possibly expand, it may be worthwhile, I believe, to contemplate how the involvement of digital technologies will restructure and ultimately shape existing patterns of cross-sector collaboration and the ways it's being carried out. Looked upon a larger time per view, which is something very seldom done, I must admit, technology appears as a potent source and force of social and institutional restructuring. That impact, of course, is neither simple nor unidirectional. By contrast to nature, technology is a human invention, and most of the available technologies have been responses to social problems and the way such problems have been discussed, as Tom alluded to, and then addressed as issues of engineering. Yet, and that's, I think, is very important, and here I may understand that some people may not like the message I have to deliver. Once in place, technologies have lasting effects on the social body that occur in the form of skill diffusion. I say some things, there are others. Skill diffusion, division of labor, habit formation, the establishment of rules and practices, modes of communication, habit, new ways of organizing, if you like, production and cooperation. Technology is a recalcitrant ally. It entails non-negotiable presuppositions, I want to stress that require profound adaptation on the part of social agents. You may think you use Twitter, Facebook, or Google the way you wish, and which is partly true, but equally true is the fact that being participant in these online environments requires accepting specific, and I would say very specific versions of being a user, and often unknowingly succumbing to the ways a potent backstage machinery computes and shapes user actions. Relying on digital technologies to achieve key goals in cross-sectional collaboration will undeniably provide, I believe, an opportunity to do things that would have otherwise been difficult or even impossible to pursue. But it will also require and bring about changes, some by design as the outcome of non-negotiable presupposition I spoke earlier, and others unintentionally. Now, it would be a hubris on my part to pretend to tell you what will happen in a field that you know far better than me. Yet I can share with you some tentative thoughts that are informed by current research on digital technologies and institutions. I will by necessity, and I want to make that clear, touch only the top of the iceberg. One of the most important changes, as Oana alluded to, would be the use of platforms as widespread arrangements through which key stakeholders will pursue their collaborations and interventions. Partnerships and other relations will increasingly be forced to contend with a reordering of social, economic, and political priorities as these are reframed and mediated by platforms. I can scarcely do justice here to the cross-disciplinary literature on the matter, but one could imagine that such practices as resource and knowledge sharing, important for partnerships, open innovation, and presumably crowdsourcing, among many others, will expand their reach in international partnerships or make significant inroads in those areas in which they still remain marginal. These developments, I think, will give rise to new relations and new networks facilitated in part by distributed information, new forms of agency and action, some of which may transcend nation-state borders and the remits of traditional global organizations that many NGOs and many of you may have worked with. But the most profound change will likely be the ways by which data will come to shape and influence collaboration in technologically mediated environments as those of platforms. If platforms are setting of social interaction and by extension collaboration, this is to a large degree the accomplishment of how technology is called upon to organize platform participation. This is a not natural thing. This requires usually the technological translation of what can be done and how, as well as the technological standards and methods for monitoring and assessing actions. While again, I can't enter the details of this hyper-complex process, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that such technological translation takes the form of setting up the entities of social interaction, that is, actors and what they do, their tasks, and providing critically the scores and metrics that structure and assess the behavior of these entities, which are often recycled back to actors in loops that are only reinforcing and expanding. I can assure that this is an emerging world about which we currently know little. I would like to conclude with an invitation to the partnerships community and its thoughtful work over the years to consider how their own understanding of partnership is construed, programmed, and shaped by these developments, and contemplate even the implications for our capacity to act and collectively organize a better world. This requires deeper consideration with respect to how the pervasive, omnipresent digital shapes collective social interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank the panel, and thank everyone. We have 3 questions, and there will be more coming, and we have 10 minutes. So we will keep the answers as brief as possible, but as inclusive as possible of the panel. And Anne-Marie, in addition to being an organizer, she asked a fabulous question. So she's up next. So Anne-Marie, can you ask the question out loud?
Okay, I know I'd be happy to. So thank you to the panel and to Tom. It's been absolutely amazing so far. So I'm very interested in this chaos that's, the chaos around crisis. And I could view that as a kind of an liminal space as well. So when things become unsettled and turned upside down, so when topics or issues that were seen to be settled become very much unsettled, and then the reworking of and I think Raghu's case is brilliant there, and also the digital space is kind of reworking us now. So things are getting reworked in response to COVID. So I'm just interested, I suppose it's partly methodological, but it's also theoretical, but how should we then sort of follow this action? What would be your guidance or advice on how we can follow this action in our study of cross-sector interaction?
I might just jump in really quickly, if I may. I think watching how our rights are going to be taken away by government and private interests, both at the same time, working perhaps in partnership to reduce our rights, is going to be a very interesting thing to follow, all in the name of safety and the rationales being given so that our civil liberties could become increasingly limited. I'm concerned about that. So I'm following that very closely. I'll just throw that out there. Okay.
Great provocation. I am just trying to make eye contact. Jannis, you're smiling. I am going to throw this right back at you. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's not an easy way to answer it. But in my case, what I would say is that we need to lay open many of the presuppositions on the basis of which these technologies are made, because there are the major predilections for our societies. This is not easy because sometimes we don't have the knowledge and sometimes do not have access to the politics of making artifacts. But if these artifacts matter for our living, and I strongly believe that they make up our lives, you may not, then I believe that we need to approach them critically with a social angle. We are not engineers. I'm a social scientist myself, sociologist by training. We have to unpack this presupposition and try to understand what we can do good and what to resist and remake or transform or revise in order to be able, to do what we want to do, which I take is common for everybody, a better society.
Well, Oana, I don't mind jumping in. I was trying to find out where this raising your hand is in the Zoom, but I couldn't find it. So there goes Sociomateriality for you.
No, well, I was going to
Anyway,
you next, but Paula is making the challenge even harder by asking you to reflect even more specific about the risk of manufacturing scientific facts. So take it to the next level, please.
but let me go to Anne-Marie's first question, and actually I'll just jump into the other one. I'll try to be brief given the time, and would love to hear from Tom as well on this question. But my answer is rather complicated, actually, I must say. I'm going to condense it very rapidly and short. And that Anne-Marie starts with the, things are getting unsettled. Things are becoming deinstitutionalized. And I think our very fabric of scientific enterprise itself, because I'm on science today, is becoming deinstitutionalized and unsettled. The question is, what exactly is science? How do you probe into it? What is the truth? And I kind of build upon two people who are closely related to science and technology studies, but they pose themselves as actor network theorists. One of them is Michel Calon. The second one is Bruno Latour. And Michel Calon says, when I was talking to him, he says, follow the controversies, he's telling me, And that's the most interesting part about follow the controversies, because the ground has not yet settled. And that's what Bruno Latour says, don't go to the battle after it's over. Be there when it's being fought. And so the question is, the symmetry of theorization should be that whoever wins or loses, the theory which emerges is still valid. And the reason I'm saying why it kind of challenges what we do is, for most part, we are going with kind of normal science in which, the phenomena is settled and everyone is agreeing and there's inter-rater reliability and on and on. Now, the fact is that, we as researchers should not be privileged to say that we can have inter-rater reliability, whereas the people in the field can have different perspectives. That's kind of a little bit problematic, I think. So we need an apparatus to also understand how can we report these things. So to the question which Paula asks, that facts are manufactured. And so that means there are some other facts which are not manufactured, according to that question. And so I heard that question, where are those facts which are not manufactured? And so if you can show me that, I think my morning is well spent. Because my core of my talk was, where is the truth? Please tell me that. I'm asking Tom as well, where is the truth? Who has got it? Especially in the COVID science, who knows what?
You've been called out, Tom. Please speak up.
I will jump in, and I think maybe my take on it is slightly different, just because of where I come from as well. And there are a couple of sets of words that were sort of being connected to each other. One was crisis and one was chaos. Raghu brought in the idea of emergency. And I think it's important when we're looking at specific times and places that in a way we don't ourselves kind of do emergency science and don't rush into imagining that crises and chaos are the same thing, or even that they are associated with kind of liminality. From my perspective, I don't do sociology of science. I really do much more sociology of controversies. And so I've always followed the controversy. When I look at it that way, there's always been emergency science. And it's not a liminal state. It's not a temporary situation. It's a form of activity. There's always been crises, and there's always been controversies, and they have structures they're not unstructured, and they're not chaotic. Controversies themselves have structures, emergencies have structures, crises have structures, and they're very much connected to jump to the question around place and the question of manufacturing science. I'm completely with Raghu in the sense that all science is manufactured, but that's sort of neither here nor there. It's a question of how it's manufactured and with what impacts and through what processes that really matters. And so if the question is how do you follow these processes when they're in this liminal kind of situation, I would say maybe step back from assuming the liminality and assuming the temporariness of it, and assume that these are crises and emergencies and controversies that follow other crises, controversies, and emergencies, and that we learn in science and in every domain of life what to do in these contexts. And then they transport us into the next crisis and controversy and so on. Not that there's nothing new, but there might be a bit less new than our experience of it would suggest.
And thank you. I would like to summarize 3 other questions that I think fuel us as we begin the conference. On Tom's point, both Sarita and Sheila are pointing to complex intersectionalities and inequities, especially at this interface between digitalization and science and access to even having this conversation. But also going a few steps back to Tom's keynote, Laura is asking us to reflect between the social reconstruction of places and the physical and environmental materiality of environmentally significant places. And what do we do when we reconstruct socially places that we depend on for survival? Because our time is up and we have to be mindful of everyone's multiple constraints and time zones, I would leave these questions open. But in addition to this question, we always ask the notion of governance. How do we govern? Going back to what liberties can we afford to spare in the situation? We're going to this notion that Michelle is asking about what is the distinction between the partnerships that create place versus the ones that repair place. So I thank the panelists, I thank the keynote, I thank all of you for showing up in person in Limerick via Zoom. And I wish you all a phenomenal conference and many, many questions that are yet unanswered so we can build this area of inquiry together. Thank you so much.